I don't think universities can afford to be separate from society anymore. Each university has to be both global and it has to be completely unique in its local context, because otherwise, why should it exist? Why should taxpayers pay money for the brick and mortar structures that we have? If we can't be useful, we won't be allowed to exist anymore. And I think that's something that higher education hasn't quite understood. I've had unusual opportunities and an unusual pathway. And I do think that that allows me to connect a series of dots that other people might not connect. And so for me, my kind of passion and commitment towards higher education is really about thinking, how do we navigate changing knowledge needs? And that is something that kind of keeps me awake at night a great deal, because we now have a system where I feel that anything my students can Google. As I shouldn't actually need to teach them. I need to teach them how to manage knowledge, how to understand the systems behind the results that they're finding, so that they know how to find good knowledge and meet their own needs as they develop. Because the kind of career pathways that what is effectively industrial education has prepared students for no longer really exist. They're not actually possible, they're not realistic. So my students need to know how to edit Wikipedia, because they're going to read Wikipedia. And if they can't find an article about their hometown in the Eastern Cape, they must write it. And they must learn how to intervene in knowledge systems that are really driven by people in the global north, largely because it's not impossible to contribute to them, but we don't give enough energy and I think time, especially in our education system, into knowledge production and shaping the debate. Sure, so right at the beginning of the pandemic, I remember I just launched my first book, which is about Angola and Brazil, that comes out of my PhD. And I remember writing a piece about it, about the book launch, but I was also reflecting on, well, what is the pandemic going to mean in different places? I wrote this just a couple of lines in this piece about the book launch then, that was just reflecting on how for people in Angola, the borders may never open up. And I have seen that happening gradually. And at the time, we didn't really understand COVID. We didn't really know what would happen with vaccines or vaccine passports or anything like that. This was all stuff that was far beyond what we could actually imagine. But what we could easily see was that there's been an increasing segregation in global mobility, more people moving around, but a lot more rigid systems around who gets to go where. And the pandemic, in a sense, I think gives almost an excuse to really lock global north borders. And in not vaccinating everybody equally, we will then almost inevitably have a situation where it's even harder for people from certain countries to move into countries that have resources, have perhaps more opportunities for social mobility and so on. And so for me, one of the greatest challenges of this time is that in the failure of the global system to ensure equal treatment around vaccination, equal treatment around healthcare, equal treatment around responses, you then have a justification for the kinds of discriminatory practices that, slavery, colonialism, neoliberalism, World Trade Organization financial policies, basically when one group of people is writing the rules, they write them to benefit themselves. And you can say that that's understandable as a kind of human activity, but it's really problematic when it affects billions of people's lives and life prospects. My view at the moment is that we're going to see much more of that. Depending on how the virus shifts and mutates, there's obviously going to be a lot more restrictions on certain people and a lot more possibilities for other people. And I think that exacerbates existing systems of inequality and of unequal opportunity. And I think with that, we talk about the digital divide, but for me, I'm increasingly interested in digital capabilities where who gets to determine where the data is kept, how the data is controlled, what algorithms work and how. We live in a world where knowledge is controlled by a small group of unelected companies. Data traces are being increasingly extracted from consumers in places in the world that don't have great regulation, and being stored, analyzed, and used increasingly to intervene in democratic systems and political systems, social structures, all of that around the world. And I think that this challenge around digital capabilities and who's able to not just use the tool, but understand the tool and especially make the tool is something that is really going to impact knowledge production in the next 50 to 100 years. And I don't see that being spoken about enough. So with our students, and it's something that the Archive of Kindness project is part of, but a lot of previous work is, I really want students to be producers of knowledge, not just the consumers of it. We've almost forgotten the social mission of higher education, which is to respond to the needs of society, not to increase academics' citation index scores. If a person, say in the Vaal Triangle, who has an issue with construction, can't come to the university and say, help me with this actual project, what good is a university? Each university has to be both global and it has to be completely unique in its local context, because otherwise, why should it exist? Why should taxpayers pay money for the brick and mortar structures that we have? And also, what is the unique value add? And of course, the unique value add is the positionality of the institution in its embedded societal context. In terms of concerns, I do think in this last 10 years, human rights have become something that isn't really taken very seriously by many people anymore. And I think we're far enough away from the memory of the Second World War and the history that led to that kind of creation of human rights as a concept, as an expectation, that a lot of people have forgotten what it means to not have human rights. And I think increasingly there's this kind of anti-democratic shift that says, well, actually, we are all kind of slightly different people. And I think it becomes really interesting when you consider shifts around augmented reality, cyborg people, kind of biotechnological implants, for example, genetic editing. All these things are right here in the future with us. And the question then is, will human rights survive that? Is it possible to conceptualize all people as equal and having an equal stake for a certain kind of dignified life? And I'm deeply troubled by the fact that I think increasingly it's not, because increasingly we don't know what it means to be human. Whether to be human is to have Google glasses inserted into your brain, or is to have a heart monitor. We haven't figured out, like, where does technology stop and humanity begin? And we have to do a lot more thinking around that. I have a lot of hope in this new generation. I really, there's a lot of grumbling about millennials and Generation Z and so on, but I find them incredibly thoughtful and very clear about what's actually at stake, particularly in terms of the planet, but also in recognizing that the systems that we've inherited don't work, and to keep flogging a dead horse, to use the metaphor, isn't going to get us where we need to be. So I think that there is a new energy coming up, and I think that there's a real desire for new solutions and creative solutions. And so I find some hope in people, and I find hope in the work that everyday people are able to do in themselves and in their communities. And that is really inspiring and really powerful. I think there's a lot to be hopeful about, but we also can't afford to just be hopeful. We really need new political structures. We need opportunities for action, and we need to start changing things quite quickly, because otherwise we're literally not going to survive the next 100 years as a species. And so, I'm very cautiously hopeful.